Jack Thompson always knew his neighborhood was a little peculiar. It wasn't the manicured lawns or the cookie-cutter houses that tipped him off. Those were standard HOA fare. No, it was Karen. Karen, the HOA president, who ruled the community with an iron fist and a clipboard. Karen, who once fined a neighbor for having excessively cheerful holiday lights. Karen, who believed she was the sole arbiter of suburban perfection. And now, Karen had set her sights on Jack's fence. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an envelope. Jack found it wedged in his mailbox one sunny morning, sandwiched between a pizza coupon and a bill he'd been avoiding. The envelope was white, crisp, and official-looking, the kind of thing that screamed bad news. He sighed as he opened it, already bracing for whatever nonsense Karen had cooked up this time. "Dear Mr. Thompson," the letter began, "it has come to our attention that your wooden fence does not comply with the aesthetic standards outlined in Section 14.3b of the HOA guidelines." Jack stopped reading and stared at the paper in disbelief. His fence? His fence? The same fence that had stood proudly on his property for over a century? This wasn't just any fence. It was practically a celebrity in the world of historical landmarks. It had been built by his great-great-grandfather in 1898, back when people cared about craftsmanship and not whether their fences matched their neighbors' shutters. Jack read on, "We kindly request that you remove or replace your fence within 30 days to ensure compliance with HOA regulations." He laughed, a sharp, incredulous laugh that startled Rufus, his aging golden retriever snoozing by his feet. "Well, Rufus," Jack said, tossing the letter onto the kitchen table, "looks like Karen's finally lost her mind." Rufus blinked lazily at him, clearly unimpressed by this revelation. But Jack couldn't let it go. His fence wasn't just wood and nails. It was history, a tangible connection to his family's past and a protected landmark under state law. The audacity of Karen demanding its removal was almost impressive. Jack grabbed his phone and dialed Karen's number. She picked up on the second ring, her voice dripping with faux politeness. "Hello, this is Karen from the HOA." "Karen?" Jack said, trying to keep his tone civil despite the rising irritation in his chest. "I just got your letter about my fence." "Oh yes," Karen replied smoothly. "We've had several complaints about it not fitting the aesthetic of our community." Jack blinked. "Complaints? From who?" Karen hesitated for half a second before saying, "Well, I can't disclose names due to privacy reasons." Jack rolled his eyes so hard he thought he might strain something. Privacy reasons? The only person who ever complained about anything around here was Karen herself. "Karen," he said firmly, "my fence is a registered historical landmark protected under state law." There was a pause on the other end of the line. A pause so long Jack wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, Karen said, "Well, I wasn't aware of that." Jack smirked. "Of course you weren't. But," she continued quickly, as though she hadn't just admitted to being completely uninformed, "the HOA guidelines still apply to all properties in this neighborhood." Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Are you seriously suggesting that your HOA rules override state law?" Karen didn't miss a beat. "I'm simply saying that we have standards to uphold." Jack hung up before he said something he'd regret, or worse, something Rufus would overhear and judge him for later. For the rest of the day, Jack couldn't shake his frustration. It wasn't just about the fence. It was about principle. Karen's obsession with control had gone too far this time, and Jack wasn't about to let her bulldoze over history, or him. As he sat on his porch that evening, staring at his beloved fence bathed in the golden glow of sunset, Jack made a decision. If Karen wanted a fight over this fence, she'd get one, and he'd make sure it was a battle she'd never forget. Jack was ready for war, but this wasn't going to be a quick skirmish. No, this was shaping up to be a drawn-out siege, the kind of battle where paperwork flies like arrows and legal jargon becomes the weapon of choice. Karen, in her infinite arrogance, had decided that the HOA's rules were somehow more powerful than state law. Jack couldn't decide whether she was delusional or just really committed to her role as suburban dictator. Either way, he was about to make her regret every smug email she'd ever sent. After receiving Karen's dismissive reply to his meticulously crafted email, complete with historical documentation and legal citations, Jack realized he needed reinforcements. He called Susan, his lawyer and longtime friend, who had a reputation for dismantling HOA boards like a wrecking ball through a sandcastle. Susan listened to Jack's rant with the patience of someone who had heard far worse HOA horror stories. When he finished, she said simply, "Oh, we're going to have fun with this." Susan didn't waste any time. She drafted a cease and desist letter that could make even the most hardened bureaucrat break into a cold sweat. It was full of phrases like violations of state preservation statutes and potential civil liabilities, which Jack imagined Karen reading with her trademark scowl. The letter also included a polite reminder that any further attempts to alter or remove the fence would result in immediate legal action, and possibly fines large enough to bankrupt the HOA's snack budget for their monthly meetings. Jack delivered the letter himself, walking up to Karen's house with Rufus trotting beside him like an adorable sidekick. Karen opened the door wearing her usual expression of superiority, which faltered slightly when Jack handed her the envelope. "What's this?" she asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. "Just some light reading," Jack replied cheerfully. "Thought you might want to brush up on state law." Karen narrowed her eyes but took the envelope without another word. Jack walked away feeling triumphant, but he knew better than to think this was over. Karen wasn't the type to back down gracefully. She was the type to double down on bad decisions and call it leadership. Sure enough, 2 days later Jack received another letter from Karen, this one even more absurd than the last. It claimed that while his fence might be a historical landmark, it still violated HOA guidelines and needed to be removed for the greater good of the community. Jack laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. The greater good? Karen couldn't even keep track of whose trash bins were left out overnight. What did she know about the greater good? Jack decided it was time to escalate. He called Susan again, and they hatched a plan that would make Karen wish she'd never picked up that clipboard in the first place. First, Susan filed an official complaint with the state's Historical Preservation Office, alerting them to Karen's attempts to destroy a protected landmark. Then she sent copies of all relevant documents to every member of the HOA board, not just Karen, in case they weren't aware of their president's reckless behavior. Meanwhile, Jack started gathering allies among his neighbors. He knew he wasn't alone in his frustrations with Karen. She'd been terrorizing the community for years with her arbitrary rules and power trips. Jack knocked on doors, shared his story, and found that nearly everyone had their own Karen horror story. There was Bob down the street who'd been fined for having unauthorized mulch in his garden, and Lisa next door who'd received a violation notice for hanging wind chimes deemed too noisy. Together, they formed an unofficial anti-Karen coalition. Karen must have sensed the growing resistance because she started ramping up her efforts. One morning Jack woke up to find a bright orange notice taped to his front door, declaring his fence a hazardous structure. The notice threatened immediate removal if he didn't comply within 48 hours. Jack ripped it down and marched straight to Susan's office. "She's getting desperate," Susan said with a smirk as she read the notice. "That means we're winning." Susan filed another complaint, this time directly with the HOA board, and requested an emergency meeting to address Karen's actions. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening in the community center, and Jack knew it was going to be explosive. When Friday arrived, Jack walked into the community center armed with evidence. Photos of his fence, copies of its historical designation paperwork, and even testimonials from neighbors who supported him. The room was packed. Word had spread about Karen's antics, and people were eager to see how this showdown would unfold. Karen sat at the front of the room looking smug as ever, but Jack noticed her grip on her clipboard was tighter than usual, a sign that maybe she wasn't as confident as she pretended to be. The meeting began with Susan presenting Jack's case in her usual no-nonsense style. She laid out every detail: the fence's historical significance, its legal protections under state law, and Karen's repeated attempts to violate those protections. By the time Susan finished speaking, several board members were exchanging uneasy glances. Karen tried to defend herself by claiming she was only enforcing HOA guidelines for the sake of neighborhood harmony. But when Susan pointed out that Karen had ignored multiple legal warnings and risked hefty fines for both herself and the HOA, even Karen couldn't keep up her facade. The board voted unanimously in favor of Jack, declaring his fence untouchable and ordering Karen to cease all further action against him immediately. As Jack walked out of that meeting victorious, he couldn't help but smile at Karen's furious expression. She might have lost this battle, but knowing her stubbornness, Jack suspected she wasn't done yet. But neither was he, and now he had an army of neighbors ready to stand by his side if Karen tried anything else foolish. Jack had won the battle, but as anyone who's ever dealt with an HOA knows, the war was far from over. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat gracefully. No, she was the type to stew in her own indignation and plot her next move while clutching her clipboard like a villain clutching their monologue. Jack knew she wouldn't let this go, but he also knew he wasn't about to let her get the last word. If Karen wanted to play games, Jack would play, and he'd make sure she regretted ever stepping onto his property. It started with a surprise inspection. Jack was sitting on his porch enjoying a cup of coffee when Karen appeared on the sidewalk, flanked by two HOA board members who looked like they'd been dragged out of their homes against their will. Karen had an air of determination about her, like she was auditioning for the role of neighborhood dictator in a low-budget reality show. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Karen chirped, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "We're here to conduct a follow-up inspection of your property." Jack raised an eyebrow. Follow-up inspection? For what? Karen's smile widened in that way people smile when they're trying to look friendly but are actually plotting your downfall. "Just routine procedure," she said, gesturing for her reluctant entourage to follow her onto Jack's lawn. Jack watched as Karen marched around his yard, pointing at random things and muttering under her breath. At one point, she stopped in front of Rufus's doghouse and scribbled something furiously on her clipboard. Jack couldn't hear what she was saying, but he could tell it wasn't good. When Karen finally left, Jack found a bright orange violation notice taped to his front door. It listed a series of alleged infractions that ranged from unapproved landscaping to unauthorized pet structures. Jack stared at the notice in disbelief. Unauthorized pet structures? Was Karen seriously trying to fine him for Rufus's doghouse? Jack didn't even bother calling Susan this time. He knew exactly how he wanted to handle this. If Karen wanted to nitpick every detail of his property, then Jack would give her something worth nitpicking. The next morning, Jack got up early and started working on his masterpiece. A giant banner that read "Historical Landmark Protected by State Law" in bold letters. He hung it across his fence so that anyone walking or driving past would see it immediately. But Jack didn't stop there. He added smaller signs along the fence with messages like "Karen Free Zone" and "Ask me about my legal rights." The neighbors loved it. People stopped by to compliment Jack on his creativity and share their own stories about Karen's tyranny. Even Bob from down the street, who usually kept to himself, came over to laugh at the signs and tell Jack about the time Karen tried to fine him for having non-regulation mulch. The anti-Karen coalition was growing stronger by the day. Karen, however, was not amused. She sent another letter demanding that Jack remove the signs immediately, claiming they violated HOA guidelines regarding visual harmony. Jack responded by adding even more signs, this time with quotes from historical preservation laws and excerpts from the governor's letter congratulating him on maintaining his family's legacy. Karen escalated further by calling an emergency HOA meeting to address what she called Mr. Thompson's blatant disregard for community standards. Jack attended the meeting armed with his usual stack of documents and a newfound sense of theatrical flair. When it was his turn to speak, Jack stood up and said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the HOA board, I'd like to thank you for gathering here today to discuss my fence. A fence that has survived wars, economic depressions, and now Karen's clipboard." The room erupted in laughter, except for Karen, who looked like she'd just swallowed a lemon. Jack continued, "I understand that some people may find my signs disruptive or unsightly, but let me remind you that these signs are not just decorations. They're statements of fact supported by state law." He held up a copy of the landmark certificate for dramatic effect. By the end of the meeting, even some of Karen's former allies were starting to question whether she'd gone too far. The board voted against taking any action against Jack's signs, much to Karen's dismay. But Karen wasn't done yet. A few days later, Jack woke up to find that someone had spray painted over one of his signs during the night. The words "neighborhood disgrace" were scrawled across it in bright red paint. A clear attempt at intimidation. Jack didn't get angry, he got creative. He repainted the sign with an even bigger message. Vandalism is not leadership. He added floodlights around his fence so that anyone attempting another midnight attack would be caught red-handed. Karen tried one last desperate move, filing a formal complaint with the local zoning office claiming that Jack's fence violated height restrictions. But when zoning officials came out to inspect the property, they confirmed that not only was Jack's fence perfectly legal, it was also exempt from certain regulations due to its historical status. The zoning officials left with smiles on their faces after hearing about Karen's antics. One of them even joked, "Sounds like you've got your hands full with this HOA president." Jack grinned. "You have no idea." By now, Karen had become something of a neighborhood punchline. People started referring to overly strict rules as doing a Karen, and someone even made t-shirts that said, "I survived Karen's clipboard patrol." Jack wore one proudly whenever he worked in his yard. In the end, Karen couldn't win. Not against state law, not against Jack's determination, and certainly not against an entire neighborhood united by their shared disdain for her micromanaging ways. And while Jack didn't set out to become a local hero, he couldn't deny that it felt pretty good knowing he'd stood up for himself, and for history, against someone who thought rules were more important than reason. As he sat on his porch one evening watching Rufus chase squirrels near the fence, Jack couldn't help but smile at how far they'd come. The fence still stood tall and proud, a testament not just to his family's legacy but also to the power of persistence and a really good lawyer. Jack's victory over Karen had become the stuff of neighborhood legend. The fence stood tall, the signs gleamed under their floodlights, and Karen's clipboard patrols had grown noticeably less frequent. But Jack wasn't done yet. Winning wasn't enough. Not when Karen had spent weeks trying to bulldoze his family's legacy, literally. No, Jack wanted to make sure Karen never forgot this defeat. He wanted to leave her with a reminder so permanent, so undeniable, that every time she looked at his property, she'd feel the sting of her own hubris. It began with a plaque. Jack commissioned a custom bronze plaque that read, "This fence is a protected historical landmark. Destroying it is a crime." He mounted it on the fence post closest to the sidewalk, making sure it was at eye level for anyone passing by. But Jack wasn't satisfied with just a plaque. He wanted something bigger, bolder, and impossible to ignore. That's when he decided to host a neighborhood event, the Fence Festival. The idea was simple: celebrate the historical significance of his fence while simultaneously poking fun at Karen's failed attempts to tear it down. Jack sent out invitations to every household in the neighborhood, promising free food, live music, and a guided historical tour of the fence. He even hired a local band to perform songs inspired by HOA drama. Titles included Clipboard Blues and Karen Took My Garden Gnomes. The festival was a hit. Families showed up in droves, kids ran around with balloons shaped like fences, and neighbors took turns posing for pictures next to the infamous landmark. Jack gave an impassioned speech about the importance of preserving history while subtly roasting Karen's obsession with neighborhood aesthetics. The crowd roared with laughter when he pointed out that his fence had more character than half the houses on the block. Karen didn't attend the festival. Of course she didn't. But Jack noticed her peeking through her blinds as people cheered and clapped in front of his property. She must have been fuming, but there was nothing she could do about it. Jack had turned her vendetta into a community-wide celebration, and now she was powerless to stop it. After the festival, Jack decided to take things one step further. He reached out to the local historical society and invited them to feature his fence in their next newsletter. They loved the idea and sent over a photographer to capture its rustic charm. The article they published was titled "A Fence That Stood Against Time, an HOA Tyranny," complete with quotes from Jack about his family's legacy and Karen's misguided attempts to erase history. The newsletter spread like wildfire, not just in Jack's neighborhood but across town. People started driving by just to see the famous fence, snapping photos and leaving notes of encouragement in Jack's mailbox. One particularly enthusiastic visitor even left a hand-drawn sketch of the fence with the caption, "Karen can't touch this." Meanwhile, Karen's reputation continued to crumble. Her once loyal supporters on the HOA board had grown tired of her antics, especially after she dragged them into multiple legal disputes over something as trivial as a wooden fence. At the next HOA election, Karen was unceremoniously voted out as president, a decision that was met with quiet relief from everyone except Karen herself. Jack heard about her downfall from Bob down the street, who stopped by one morning with coffee and donuts as a thank you for taking one for the team. Bob grinned as he recounted how Karen had tried to rally support for her re-election campaign by promising stricter enforcement of HOA guidelines. "Turns out nobody wants more rules," Bob said with a chuckle. Who knew? With Karen dethroned and his fence firmly protected, Jack could finally relax, or so he thought. One day, while watering his plants, he noticed Karen walking down the sidewalk toward his property. She wasn't carrying her clipboard, a rare sight, but her expression was unmistakably sour. "Hello, Mr. Thompson," she said stiffly when she reached the edge of his yard. Jack looked up from his watering can and smiled. "Karen, what brings you here?" Karen hesitated for a moment before saying, "I just wanted to let you know that I'm stepping down from my position on the HOA board." Jack raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Karen continued, "I hope we can put all this behind us now." Jack couldn't resist. "Put what behind us? You mean your attempt to destroy my fence? Or your attempt to find me for Rufus's doghouse? Or maybe your midnight vandalism spree?" Karen's face turned redder than Rufus's favorite chew toy. "I made mistakes," she muttered. Jack nodded solemnly. "We all make mistakes, Karen." She turned on her heel and walked away without another word. As Jack watched her retreating figure, he felt an odd mix of satisfaction and pity. Karen had lost everything: her position on the HOA board, her credibility in the neighborhood, and even her clipboard patrols, which were now considered more of a joke than an authority. But Jack didn't feel bad enough to let her off easy. After all, she'd brought this on herself. That evening, Jack added one final touch to his fence: a small sign that read "Victory Garden," surrounded by freshly planted flowers. It wasn't just about celebrating his win. It was about reminding everyone that history matters and bullies don't always get their way. And so life returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be in a neighborhood where people still talked about the Great Fence War like it was some kind of epic saga passed down through generations. As for Karen, she faded into obscurity like an outdated HOA guideline nobody bothered enforcing anymore. And as for Jack, well, he became something of a local legend, the man who stood up against tyranny armed only with paperwork and sheer stubbornness. So if you ever find yourself facing an unreasonable HOA president or someone who thinks their clipboard gives them unlimited power, remember Jack Thompson. And remember that sometimes revenge is best served with humor, and maybe a really good lawyer. If you enjoyed this story, and let's be honest, you did, don't forget to like, share, comment below with your own HOA horror stories, and subscribe for more tales of justice served cold.